Oh, I don't
Okay.
have that. What's that?
Silence.
Yeah. Yeah, you can join anytime, actually. You want to start?
Good morning. I'm going to call the meeting to order, and we will be joined shortly.
Oh, there he is.
We've been joined by Commissioner Levy on the phone, so I'd like to acknowledge his presence at the meeting. And also,
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Welcome to all the new employees in the audience. Call for motion and second to grant a leave of absence to Commissioner Alexander, who's out of town. All in favor? Any opposed?
Aye.
Are you opposed, Commissioner Levy, or?
No, I support the motion.
Thank you. I'll now call for a motion and second for approval of the minutes of the regular commission meeting of March 13th, 2019.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. I'll ask Curtis for the executive director's report and his remarks.
Terrific. Thank you, Madam President. Good morning, everyone. I'd also like to welcome our new employees at the back of the room. We just had a few minutes together. Really excited to have you all here. And as noted earlier, and I think you got it first from Steve Danielson and you got it from me as well, safety is a really important part of what everyone does every day here at the Port. I'd like to start first by recognizing our safety champions up here. Again, you'll note a nice mix of long-term and new employees up there. It's just a nice indication of folks who are really going the extra mile on safety. Stan, would you share a safety message with us this morning, please?
Sure. First, I would just like to report on the Port's progress on our employee safety and health program. The Port continues to take some ground on our journey to advance our safety culture. We're building capability to have safety and health discussions in the workplace among supervisors and individual contributors. And I just want to highlight a few of these significant accomplishments. First, Port Safety and each business line are working through employee safety perception survey action plans and engaged employees and with engaged employees and improvement teams. This is targeted culture building work on indicators that employees shared with leadership through completion of the employee safety perception survey back in May of 2018. Second, occupational hazards are being reported more frequently and timely than before, with employees using the report hazard button on our intranet site. Those safety opportunities are then being tracked using our corrective action pathing tool. And so far in this fiscal year, we are reporting an 80% closure rate on 104 issues that have been reported. And third, education and training is currently being facilitated by the safety team with business line leadership on fact-finding incident investigations to drive continuous improvement across business lines where a near miss has been reported or property damage or an injury incident occurs. While these safety initiatives are being executed and improved, the employees of the port lowered their total recordable injury rate further to 1.52, the lowest rate ever achieved by the port on a 12-month rolling basis. Very proud of that, and all the employees should be proud of that. Now to my safety message. This brief message may ring familiar from previous April messages, or perhaps maybe your own observations as you commuted here today. The port is again participating in Distracted Driving Awareness Month and educating the public as needed using our traffic patrols. The opportunity to improve driver safety is too big to ignore, as driving is the most dangerous activity that most of us will do. Every day, at least 9 Americans die and 100 are injured in distracted driving crashes. So I ask that you ignore the distractions and just drive. That's the theme of the National Safety Council's Awareness Month this month. And to keep all of our roads safer. I'm also asking everyone to take some action. Inventory your driving distractions and eliminate them, and model the safe driver that your kids may emulate. And more information on distracted driving is available through the National Safety Council, and I just ask everyone to take the pledge to just drive. That's it.
Great.
Curtis.
Thank you, Stan. And again, congratulations to the whole team and all port employees on that safety number. It's really great progress. Really proud of that as well. Really good to see. A few updates, and for new employees, I get the mic once a month for about 10 minutes, and my use of the time is essentially to try to update the commission and folks in the audience about what's going on broadly at the port, and we call them the Executive Director Report. This month I'd like to start with our effort to raise funds through the commission passed approval of selling of bonds, which we did last week. The port team, both finance and legal, and a number of others were deeply involved, but Lisa Fideli in particular deserves a bit of call out. We sold at really great rates about $400 million worth of bonds last week. That's money that will fund our CFC project out here for rental cars. I'm sorry, it's the CONRAC, funded through CFCs, and the Terminal Core project. So it's the first $400 million of what will likely be several hundred million more, but really excited about the effort that went into it. We talked, I think it was 2 months ago, about kind of what numbers are we talking about in terms of rates, and the rates the team were able to sell the bonds at were 3.69% for the tax exempt and 4.12% for the taxable bonds. So really great numbers. I'm really happy about that. At the airport, I really want to thank the operations team who did a great job. It was almost 1 million passengers over the 2-week period for spring break, 955,000 travelers, with a peak ended April 7th. Peak days were approximately 57,000 passengers a day. So just really busy time in the airport. I would say without incident, but there were lots of incidents and they were handled very well and professionally. Last month, you may have noticed we also launched At Your Gate, which is a way that passengers can use an app and get food delivered to their gate where they're taking off. Order and pick up yourself, or delivery for now, or a scheduled delivery. You can get on up to 24 hours ahead of time and say, I'm going to be at gate C8 and I want my Bambuza pho delivered, and it will be at the gate for you as scheduled. Pretty cool. It's the first airport nationally. We are the first airport nationally to offer those 3 options. If you're not already TSA PreCheck, it's time. It's a really good time to get TSA PreCheck. 92% of TSA PreCheck passengers have waited less than 5 minutes nationwide, and I think everyone here can attest it's even slightly shorter than that here at PDX. We're making it easier this month by setting up a registration center at PDX now through April 26th, so that folks can go and get registered TSA PreCheck at PDX for the next several weeks in baggage claim near Carousel 2. So there you go. What you'll see in construction outside on the facility, still a lot going on, something we'll be getting used to here for the next several years. But if you're leaving Airport parking lot, you'll see a lot of construction to move the exit plaza to the east side. That will be the first structure built for the new parking garage. Connected to the parking garage will be the exit plaza structure out here just to the east of this building. This month, construction focuses on employee lot reconfiguration so that we can make the exit out directly onto Airport Way. We're doing a lot of early site work, utility and roadway relocations, and the first phase of the South Tunnel extension. It's a lot going on. It's been a lot of fun, and if you look out and see the E concourse extension, the roof is almost completely now watertight. Pretty exciting to see. Just 9 months ago, it was slab work, and so it's great progress, still on schedule and remarkably on budget as well. So, Madam President, those are my comments this morning.
Thank you, Curtis. I'll call for a motion and second for approval of the executive director's report.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. It's a public comment period, and I believe we have Mr. Swarren signed up for public comment.
Port of Portland's going to weigh in on some of the big transportation issues. I know many people in this area have talked about a need for a port-to-port connection. That's not exactly what I want to talk about. I want to talk about some of the big projects being considered, but ways that maybe we could accomplish the things that we need for a lower cost. I participated a couple years ago in this Washington County Transportation Futures Study. I heard one of the managers from the port, Susie Lassane, come, and she said that it was vital to Washington County to have more routes to the ports. And I've seen the Washington County economy grow. I started working out there in 1990 and saw how the whole region was shifting as far as traffic patterns and commuting. And one thing that this study, this is the executive summary from the study, one thing that they point out as a future project was what they call the Northern Connector. It would be a highway from US 26 to US 30 and then connecting to Columbia Boulevard. And on the portion, I know at least to Columbia Boulevard, and I believe the whole route, they had designated that as a future high-capacity transit corridor. So that actually could provide some transit service to the airport. Vancouver, Washington has long wanted some type of connection for better mass transit, so that would be a connection. But the main point I want to get at is there's a lot of discussion now about changes to I-5. We have a group in Washington now that's got approval from the Washington legislature to open an office in Vancouver. They're proposing initially $450 million just to look into replacing I-5 and the I-5 bridge. I don't believe that that kind of project is really needed, and that's why I cited the Northern Connector in this Washington County study. Trying to replace I-5 would be very expensive. It wouldn't really result in improved traffic flow in Portland because with the added population and freight, the rest of I-5 is going to continue to be impacted. We're just going to be dumping more traffic onto I-5 and spending a lot of money on improving the bridge and really large-scale improvements to I-5 would really be not spending it very wisely. Therefore, some of these ideas for tolling of I-5 I don't think are very wise because we should only have tolling if the projects are expensive, but if we can do them for much lower costs, then there's less need for the tolling. And that's why I believe this Northern Connector out in Washington County would be the best solution. I believe it can be done relatively inexpensively. one thing I have noticed, it would need a bridge over the Willamette, and there's some Port of Portland owned land on the east side of the Willamette River. So I don't know how the port would transfer that to a highway jurisdiction. I mean, it's kind of an issue, I've found, there are various obstacles there, but it's still a very reasonable route and is well evaluated in this study. So anyway, if the port is called upon to make any kind of input into these major traffic issues, I do hope you will support this Western connector. I believe it's really vital to the Washington County economy, and I think it's a very much less costly way to go to solve our traffic problems.
Thank you, Mr. Swearing. Go ahead.
May I?
Sure.
I don't want to interrupt commissioners if they have questions. Thank you, Mr. Swearing. I'll just update you a little bit on where we've been. We've been made aware of the connector project and are monitoring. I understand it might be studied in some material way. We do have some property that was included in some early drawings, and we haven't been involved in those conversations, but it's an interesting idea. A very expensive one, but an interesting one. Very broadly, we've been advocating for a very broad approach for reducing congestion on our roads and highways, but not just one solution. Essentially, we need to get people off the road into transit and other modes. Second, we think congestion pricing is a big part of how you use economics to drive behavior. And third, we really need to address bottlenecks as they appear and arise, thus the conversation around the Rose Quarter, but also the I-5 bridge. So thank you for your comments and your advocacy. Really appreciate you coming and sharing your view with us. We're definitely interested and engaged in what our transportation future might look like.
Yeah, C-Tran had said that they would be interested in this northern connector as a possible express route into Hillsborough. So I've been trying to sell TriMet on the idea too. Anyway.
Great. Well, thank you very much for coming in.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. I'd call Kristen Leonard, who will introduce Scott Drum and Tim Dewey, please.
Terrific. I'll just stay here while Scott and Tim get settled in. If you'll recall, a year ago when we had our budget presentation and our conversation, we had invited Josh Lerner from the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis to come kind of, before getting into port budget conversations, give us a larger, broader overview. And we thought that was a really valuable kind of way to start the conversation. So we are fortunate enough today to have Dr. Tim Dewey here from University of Oregon. I'll have our Director of Research, Scott Drum, introduce him, and we'll kick off the big picture.
Thank you, Kristen. Good morning. As Kristen said, we are very fortunate to have with us today Tim Dewey, who is a professor of economics at the University of Oregon, where he is also the senior director of the Oregon Economic Forum and author of the University of Oregon's statewide and regional economic indicators. He currently serves on the Oregon Governor's Council of Economic Advisors and the State Debt Policy Advisory Commission. Prior to returning to the University of Oregon, where he got both a master's and PhD, Tim worked at the U.S. Department of Treasury and as an economic consultant back in Washington, D.C. So while Tim is here today to present his perspective, the big picture on the economy, he is also here to answer any questions you might have about the economy. Tim?
All right. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate that introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. So I've been talking about the possibility, or I don't want to say the possibility. I've been talking about recessions lately just because it's been in the news. And I think it's important to sort of understand where we think recessions come from and why it's been in the news and what people are concerned about. So I just have to figure out how to use this. Now I've totally messed it up. Go ahead and figure that out for me. Thank you, Scott.
Right.
All right. So I got an email from a journalist yesterday who said that they'd gotten a survey that 84% of executives thought there was going to be a recession between now and the end of 2020, which was a fairly high number, 84% of executives. And so I wanted to think about, well, why is it that so many executives are thinking about this? And I've got a fairly simple answer, and that's essentially a psychological one. This is pretty much the longest economic expansion we've had in the United States. By June, it will be 10 years old. And so none of us have lived through a longer economic expansion. So we have become used to the idea that economic expansions don't go on forever. That the business cycle is by definition a cycle, and so eventually you have to have a recession. And given that this is the longest one, I think executives in general and the general public often thinks, well, we must be due for a recession. And then your average business economist, and I'd like to think I'm an above average business economist, but your average business economist believes that the next recession is always 2 years off. And the reason that it's always 2 years off is just a matter of timing. It's very hard to see in the near-term data where you have a recession, and so it takes at least a year for the dynamics to develop, and so your next recession is in 2 years. So we see a lot of that kind of commentary often being passed around. And so that's where I think we have this idea that this recession or this expansion must soon be coming to the end. We've also seen it on Wall Street, particularly toward the end of last year. We saw, and this chart just an example from the Wall Street Journal, where you see survey of economists predicting a higher probability of recession in the next 12 months. I don't want to push anything. Okay, I didn't touch it. There we go. Now, I would say in the national data and in Oregon data, we don't see anything to believe that there's a recession underway at this moment or underway in the near term. It is fairly clear, I would say, particularly from the Oregon data, but from the national data as well, that there is a slowdown in economic activity occurring. One way to see this is in job growth. This is Oregon's non-farm payrolls, and in the blue, and non-farm, so employees. And then in the green, it's the U.S. non-farm payrolls or employees. And you can see that Oregon job growth has really decelerated in the last couple of years to fairly close to a little bit below the U.S. number. So this is putting us, basically not putting us backwards, but typically during the strongest part of an expansion, we'll find that the Oregon economy tends to grow a little bit faster than the U.S. economy. And typically during recessions, it's been often the opposite case. I think we've got sort of an interesting situation now, again, where this expansion has been going on 10 years, and we might not understand all the dynamics that start to be at play after 10 years because we've never seen it happen. The state has, I think, had a very good model for the last several years that predicted that eventually we'd run into supply side constraints on labor. That essentially, as the expansion aged, labor force participation rates would rise back up to their maximum. Population growth would eventually slow and migration would slow. Demographic factors would be partially driving that as baby boomers continue to age out of the labor force. And as a result, it'd be harder and harder to find workers. And I think that model has actually worked out quite well. And we're seeing the job growth slow as anticipated deeper into this expansion. That's not, I would not say that that's necessarily a problem with the Oregon economy per se. It's more of the structural factors that are affecting many economies throughout many parts of the U.S. economy right now. So you can think of ways that maybe could change that, ways to increase population growth, so more in migration, more immigration. One of, I think, the harder parts there is housing costs. People don't necessarily have the incomes to move into these high housing cost areas anymore. And so even Portland, which had been a pretty good West Coast alternative for a long time, now the buzz is people moving to Boise instead as your West Coast alternative because cheaper housing prices. So that's just something to keep in mind as we move forward. The scroll wheel, thank you. That doesn't work either. Okay, so just to reiterate this point, I do a number of economic indexes, tracking the Oregon economy and local economies. The University of Oregon Economic Indicator is up into the left-hand corner of this, upper left-hand corner, and that has been a little bit lower lately. I would say generally flat. As you get to a mature stage of the cycle, some of these indicators really kind of flatten out. And so the index of economic indicators flatten out, particularly initial jobless claims, which have been flattened out for quite a while and actually rose a little bit, national and local basis. Housing permits, so some things like that that would flatten out normally in an expansion. I'd only be worried about these numbers if they really started to decline, and they haven't started to decline on a widespread basis yet. So what I see is an economy in Oregon that's continuing to grow, is most likely to continue to grow, but maybe not at the same pace that we've seen over, say, 2017, and definitely seen some slowing. I think 2018, 2019, some of that being supply side constraint driven. All right, so I know that we don't have all that much time. It is true, and I always like to put this in, is that even though this expansion has gone on for a substantial amount of time, 10 years, even though we finally got unemployment down sustainably below 4% on a national basis and on a low level on a local basis as well, certainly growth is not the only thing we care about. We also care about these mobility, income inequality and mobility issues. So I kind of add this in to say, look, I understand that even though the economy is doing well, it's not doing well for everyone, and we probably on a local level need to be working on making sure that opportunity is well expanded. Oregon is not the worst place for relative mobility, so this is the probability of moving upward relative to your parents. Green is more upward mobility, red is less upward mobility, and you can see the South, places in the Midwest have the least upward mobility, and then Oregon is kind of mixed, somewhere in the middle for the most part, and then a lot of regions in the center of the country actually are fairly green, and it's also neighborhood based. So we look at something where your probability of the household income of children from lower income parents are likely to be lower in certain areas of the city that are characterized by lower socioeconomic status. So these are still things that even I'm a macroeconomist generally is what I do. I study, I spend a lot of time on interest rates, monetary policy, those sorts of things. Those aren't the only things we care about, and so we always have to have our decision making grounded, I think, in some of these local issues. Okay, so, so back on to whether you're going to have a recession in the near term. So certainly toward the end of last year, more people were interested in recessions. This is Google Trends. So you see a spike up in searches related to recession at the end of 2017. Now, I kind of went back and said, what does this look like to a real recession? Something we know was a recession. And we go back to 2007, and we see a much larger spike in recession interest. So that sort of suggests to me, well, there's some interest. Maybe it's not the kind of interest we typically see if people were really deeply worried about a recession. And then I kind of also put this against Oregon Ducks football. And only in a real recession do people care about recessions more than Oregon Ducks football. And basically, most of the time, we care more about the football than anyways. This joke goes over better in the dream. So I'm sorry to be right, exactly. I always think I need to do that again. So what happened at the end of last year? One thing that happened is certainly stock market shuttered, shall we say. There was a pretty big decline in stock prices that has since been largely made up. So that was certainly something that was in the news. Part of that's really a reflection of a change in the economic environment going into 2018. So this is analyst expectations for S&P Corporation earnings growth. And basically, it's a way of saying that being an analyst is fairly easy. At the beginning of the year, you always predict that earnings growth is going to be 12%. For whatever year it is, for some reason, analysts always predict 12% growth, right? So that suggests there's something wrong in their methodology to begin with, right? And over the course of the year, typically earnings expectations have been coming down. So people are very optimistic at the beginning of the year, and then over the course of the year, they decrease. 2018 was very different because 2018 saw the big fiscal stimulus come through and tax cuts. So 2018, you started with high expectations for earnings growth, and they went higher. So 2018 was really a great a year for corporate profits, and a lot of that was reflected in stock prices in 2017. So investors brought that forward. Now, if we look at growth in expected growth for this year, 2019, we're back to the usual pattern where investors are starting to say, well, earnings growth is not going to be that great. Right? So on a broad sort of basis, corporate earnings growth is not going to be what we saw certainly last year. And that's something that's going to be weighing on stock prices, or we'd expect to weigh on stock prices. And we'd also expect to have some impact on the economy because firms might pull back somewhat. There's lots of other things going on. Wage growth has been high and exceeding inflation, which is great for workers, something we actually would really like to maintain and continue. But firms find themselves in an problem of squeezed margins. And they have to find a way to compensate, either by expanding their market share, either by growing, becoming increasingly productive, factors like those sorts of things. One of the examples I just read was Bank of America planning to pay all their tellers entry-level wages of $20 an hour. So that's a big shift, right? That becomes the minimum wage almost, so to speak. So that's going on. The lagged impact of higher interest rates, fading fiscal stimulus. We had slower global growth. We had issues in Europe. We had issues in China. We have the threat of Brexit. That could really be a fairly large shock to the economy, for the global economy and the global financial system. We have general U.S. policy uncertainty, and we have general U.S. policy uncertainty regarding trade. I'm often asked what's going to happen with trade, and I would say I have no idea, because policy is not necessarily made with some kind of consistent logical framework. So I'm never really sure how trade policy will eventually end up. But the upshot is growth is slowing in 2019. 2018 was a fairly good year. We saw growth really expand in 2017 and 2018, accelerate. That's not likely to sustain itself. Most forecasters, including the Federal Reserve, think that growth decelerates from something close to 3% in 2018 to something close to 2% going forward. So that's a substantial deceleration in U.S. economic activity, and will be felt, I think, across a wide variety of firms. Right now, sort of seeing a lot of some pressure in manufacturing, although I'd say it's still less than what we saw in, say, 2015, 2016 time period. So anytime the economy is shifting gears, you've got to sort of say, well, how quickly does it shift gears, right? Is it going to shift from a very fast rate of growth to a very slow rate of growth, or is it going to shift to a recession? That's a reasonable concern as you change, as you make a change in direction of the business cycle. So this is one reason, again, people worry, is there a recession soon around the corner? Are the good times going to come to an end? And I like to remind people that, again, there's no law of nature that says you have to have a recession. Australia has gone 28 years without a recession. That's a pretty good run, almost 3 decades without a traditional business cycle. So it's not that this has to end anytime soon. It's just been our experience that has happened. I don't think we're poised for an imminent recession, but I also have to remind myself that recessions are fairly hard to predict. Right? There's that old joke that economists have predicted 8 of the last 4 recessions, right? Is we're not really great at that. And the reason is they're rare. They stick out in our minds as really big events because they often are. But since 1960, the economy has been in recession about 13% of the time. And since 1984, about 8.3% of the time, 8.3% of the months. So you'll see some people say, oh, roughly every month has a recession chance of being 10%. But even that's really too high, because recession months are all grouped together, right? There are only a few grouped all together. So essentially, if you're not in a recession this month, the probability of being in a recession next month is almost 0. That's just the way the dynamics of these things work. So since we're in a recession right now, your best bet, your best forecast of really what's going to be happening next month is you're also not going to be in a recession. This is another way to look at it, is really since 1960, all the gray areas are periods of recession. And you see the blue lines here, the decreases in non-farm payrolls. So fairly rare events, and those events on any period are really grouped together fairly tightly. So that's great news, but it also means that we don't necessarily know how to predict events that are fairly rare, right? Is that if things only happen randomly, then how do you even begin to understand or predict them? And that's why I think you see forecasters err on over-predicting recessions. There's probably two reasons for that. One is that if you're young in forecasting and you get a good hit early on, you make a good forecast early on, that can carry your career forward a long time. And so there's an incentive for young forecasters, I think, to over-predict recessions because the benefits are fairly high and the cost is fairly low. So you'll see a lot of recessions. I also think toward the end of someone's career, they have a recession, they have an incentive to want to go out on a highlight. So I think that the upshot is that it tends to be that you see a lot of extra predictions of recessions relative to how many are actually occurring. Now, what are the best recession indicators? Why are people sort of thinking about this? Well, one of the big signals we have is from the yield curve. So we think of the interest rates at different maturities of Treasury debt. A steep yield curve is generally a steep yield curve is where interest rates at longer term debt is higher than interest rates at short term debt. And that generally conditions favorable economic conditions, is that's where people expect that at some point in the future, the Federal Reserve is going to have to tighten interest rates. An inverted yield curve is one where longer term interest rates are lower than short term interest rates. And that's an indication that people expect, investors expect, that the Federal Reserve will have to cut interest rates. Well, that occurs during a recession. I would say a fairly flat yield curve is really where you'd like to be. It's hard to maintain and achieve a flat yield curve, but that's very much what we saw in the late 1990s, where the yield curve was fairly flat. As it is now, actually, there's actually a slight inversion right now. A flat yield curve would suggest that monetary policy isn't really going to change, and that usually happens in a fairly good, steady equilibrium. That's really, I think, the situation we're looking at. Now, and this is one of your more worrisome charts, so don't focus on it too much. But if you look at these yield curve spreads, when the yield curve inverts, there's been a recession within 12 to 24 months afterwards. And if I just do a probability of recession just based on that, we see probabilities of recession that are fairly similar to what we've seen in front of other recessions. I would say that this method is not very good at differentiating between flat yield curves and inverted yield curves, right? Because we're talking about fairly small differences between those two. And so this method, I think, will over-predict recessions during flat yield curves. My main concern is that when the yield curve becomes flat or inverts, is that when we typically see in recessions, it's because the Federal Reserve kept raising interest rates. Basically, the Federal Reserve made what I would call policy error, kept raising interest rates. That doesn't seem to be the problem this time. So you took out another one of my slides, I see. Okay, that's fine. I know you told me that. So if I include other leading indicators, it's not nearly so worrisome. But we're seeing sort of, I would say, something similar to what we've seen in, say, the mid-1990s, where there was a slowdown, 2015, 2016, where we had an economic slowdown. Some episodes like that I see repeated in the data right now. Again, that would be consistent with the story that the economy is slowing. So what do I look at? When the yield curve inverts, particularly the 2-year interest rate moving higher than the 10-year interest rate, which we haven't quite had yet, then I start to pay a little bit more attention to the probability of recession. I become more worried if the Federal Reserve keeps hiking interest rates after that point. And then I start to actually move to more of a recession watch. And then I'm looking for leading indicators to start rolling over. Initial unemployment claims, which have been very low and actually started to rise, but then really pulled back. Temporary help payrolls, capital spending, manufacturing hour work. There's a lot of potential indicators to be paying attention to. So I'm somewhere between stage 1 and stage 2 here, as the yield curve really hasn't inverted at the 10-2 horizon. At the 10 3-month horizon, it has, but temporarily. But also, the Federal Reserve has basically said they're done raising interest rates. And this is a big, I think, from a macro perspective, a very important point, is the Federal Reserve has a lot of power to cushion the economy, or at least has tended in the past to have a lot of power to cushion the economy. So having the Federal Reserve actually move to the sidelines before there's widespread recessionary indicators, I think is a good sign about the ability of the economy to maintain this expansion, albeit at a somewhat slower pace than we've seen in recent years. And so the shifts that I've seen are fairly encouraging. Also, that suggests to me the Federal Reserve is not terribly worried about inflation, which they shouldn't be, which means they're going to be more quick to respond to negative shocks. And as we said, trade shocks, international shocks, lots of things that could come down the pipeline. And so all of those factors, I think, are fairly helpful for us looking over the next couple of years. So I'm not terribly worried about a recession. But of course, again, we're not good at predicting these things. But these are the things I'm looking at. So I'm open for questions.
Any questions?
Yes. Thank you for coming. That was very interesting. I'm interested in where you see Oregon's population growth. Will it continue on the track we're on? And if it is continuing to grow, do you see job creation matching that?
I don't see a reason to think the fundamental dynamic has changed. As the population has aged, and as the millennials have started to move out from their younger years into their older years, I do think you're going to see less inflow of population, less population growth going forward. And again, I also think there's some competitive issues to be concerned about. Housing prices for me seems to be one thing I've focused on, particularly in the Portland area, our largest economy. I'd like to be able to keep rolling along, and I think keeping housing prices contained is important to that. I don't see housing prices per se, not just the price of buying a house, but rental, the cost of housing in general. But I don't think the fundamental dynamics are going to shift. I do think that though we're downshifting into a slower pace of growth here going forward. And I think the state economists have done a fairly good job of anticipating that occurrence.
You've mentioned housing prices a couple of times. Are there other big challenges that you see to growth in the Oregon economy?
Well, I think housing challenges and transportation challenges being two factors that are affecting quality of life that I think do need to be addressed. And I become fairly frustrated that we've had issues addressing these things. My view is that housing costs are not going to come down until we bring down the cost of construction. That the bottleneck is the combination of land prices and system development charges fairly high, and so the cost of building units is fairly high relative to incomes. And I think that's a fundamental issue we haven't come to grips with. I think certain policies that we moved, such as eliminating or reducing reliance on single-family zoning, allowing more, or seems to be the direction we're going, allowing more multifamily units to be built on lots is a good move. But I don't think it will have very rapid impacts on the housing stock. Housing tends to be a long-lived capital asset. So once you build a house, once you've built a bunch of single-family housing, it's going to not change away from single-family housing very quickly. And so, it's a real challenge of how we change these dynamics going forward. Prior to the 1980s, the federal government did a lot more building of affordable housing, and that's probably a direction that would be helpful from the federal government angle.
Other questions, please?
I have a few questions, Professor Dewey. In this extended economic expansion which you articulated, you also talked about some of the traditional indicators that you watch and then predict off of. But in the expanded economic environment, do you think there are other indicators that you are looking at, and what would those be?
Yeah, one of the big sorry if I cut you off there, but one of the big challenges is that manufacturing is a smaller proportion of the economy, and a lot of our best cyclical indicators are always manufacturing indicators. And so in 2015 and 2016, for example, there was a downturn in industrial production, which never happens outside of a recession, except this past recession. And so that's a pretty big difference in past recessions. So if you focus too heavily on those manufacturing indicators, you over predicted recessions again. That's why I also focus on service sector indicators. So the Institute of Supply Management has luckily shifted to having a service sector survey, and you could actually see the divergence between the service sector and the manufacturing sector at that point. So that's one of those examples of where you're right, is the economy is a little bit different. The other challenge that I've written about is the economy's growth rate is probably closer to 2%. That's the Federal Reserve's estimate, which is a lot lower than we've seen in the past, which may be 3 or 3.5% late 1990s. What that means is that one of the things that means is that a slowdown in economic activity could push you towards zero growth, but in a non-recessionary environment. So it used to be this idea that the economy would hit some kind of stall speed at 1.5% growth. Well, that might make some kind of sense if your underlying growth rate is 3 or 3.5%, but if your underlying growth rate is only 2%, you have much more likelihood of having quarters of negative growth outside of a recession, and that can confuse the picture as well. So I try to take a very holistic view of the situation rather than focusing on any one single indicator or even one single sector. It's increasingly difficult, I think, in this environment to tell you when a recession is going to happen. That's why, again, I think it's been over-predicted over the last couple of years. And that was one question.
And the other question was, I appreciated you somewhat opening with, is it predestined that we have a recession? I think I do agree with you. I don't think it's predestined, and it does seem to be more psychological, at least the current evidence would suggest. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Right. And so, again, recessions are rare events. We don't always know. I mean, being that I'm a monetary policy analyst, it's always about the Federal Reserve. But I think there's a lot of truth to that. Has the Federal Reserve able to offset shocks quickly enough? And when they're not able to offset shocks quickly enough, that you've often ended up in recession periods. And that's certainly something that I've been paying a lot of attention to. I think, for example, Australia's probably had a very well done monetary policy framework, and so they've got a little bit more lucky than we have, and have been able to offset shocks a little bit more quickly. And so that's probably done a lot to help, I think, stabilize that economy. As far as the psychological aspects of it, firms again, in some sense, I say it's fine to be cautious, right? I mean, if you're a little bit worried about the future, and you put together a plan now for how you're going to behave, what your firm's going to do in the event of a recession, there's really no cost to that. You've really thought out your options. You've checked out your credit lines. You've checked out your supply lines. You know what customers you have. You know what other markets you can move into, right? If you do those sorts of things in advance because you're a little bit worried about a recession, there's no real harm that's been done. If you avoid a massive amount of expansion because you're worried about it, that's a little bit more of an issue. But so I don't mind for small businesses even if they get a little bit worried now and then, that's necessarily a bad thing. For financial market participants, I think it's a bad thing because they do lose out on opportunities. So, different audience in that case. But in this environment, that's kind of what I would think is appropriate. Is I don't think I'd make any large plans, but I would know what plans I wanted to do if there was a recession. And I'd also keep in mind too, there's a recency bias here. We might think that the next recession, our view of a recession is very much colored by the last recession, which was a fairly unique event. Many of us, probably none of us, were old enough to remember the Great Recession or the Great Depression, right? The last major financial crisis that the U.S. economy faced. Those types of events are fairly rare, and so I don't see any large-sized investment bubble, some massive misallocation of resources in the economy right now. There's not some massive housing bubble. There's no tech boom. There's lots of interesting little things, but nothing on a grand scale. Mm-hmm. So if you had a recession right now, it'd probably be more like one of our outlier recessions that don't really have great explanations, like the 1990 recession, which was fairly mild for Oregon and had fairly limited impacts on the state. So that's, it could be that the next recession is fairly limited, fairly short-lived. And so again, making plans as if you're planning for another great recession is maybe overly pessimistic.
Thank you. Commissioner Holleran, did you have a question?
Yeah, quick comment. I think as a port, we are, for the most part, a service-based entity, and our economic indicators are pretty lively. I mean, we see traffic in passenger volumes. We see cargo coming in both on rail through trucking and ocean going and whatnot. So we have pretty good economic indicators as a service entity. But I think one of the things with the political overlay and the global volatility on the trade front is just kind of so we're not seeing big trade deals, but we're still seeing a lot of Oregon companies expand in global markets, regardless of how their economic growth is transpiring. So I guess that's a backdrop to my question, which is how are you seeing the trade impact directly on Oregon in the next couple of years? And I think that even if you're seeing broader national economic trends, Oregon's kind of trade presence may be able to punch through some of that. And I'm just trying to think if you're seeing that.
Oregon is known as a export dependent or trade dependent economy. One of the factors I try to keep in mind is Oregon's gross domestic product is about $230 billion, and exports are about $22 billion, more or less. And then that's really not only that's some of the stuff that we count as exports moves through the ports, but it's not made here, like cars. So it's not a huge part of the economy. So and about a third of it's probably Intel. Or chips in general, so it's not a huge part of the economy, and so there's probably only so much you're going to get out of that sector right now. But I think that the broader point is important, is that to the extent that our firms can continue going forward and moving into new markets, whether they be outside of Oregon, nationally or outside of internationally, that will make the economy more resilient. Partially too, because we're not just going to move into one market. Some of our trade conflicts right now are centered on China, for example. To the extent that we move or diversify our portfolio to a number of markets, that will also lead us less susceptible to the problems of trade deals that we've seen recently. I see no reason that Oregon firms won't continue to move on the path that they will. For example, in agriculture, where we've been expanding the exports of those services, manufactured goods, machinery. There's lots of areas where we are continuing to expand our presence globally, and I don't see where that process is going to dry up anytime soon. And so, the operations that are carried on by this organization, I think could always be susceptible to near-term downturns. But as long as I like to remind people, there's a bias in the economy to growth over the long run, because people keep having babies, population keeps expanding, capital wears out, and all of us have to wake up in the morning and go get a job. And that provides some cushion to bias the economy toward growth over the long run. And I don't see a reason why that doesn't continue to happen and continue to put give Oregon firms opportunities across the globe.
Yeah, and I just to comment on that is I think our measure is on exports in terms of commodities and manufactured goods. But for example, Nike, where I work, our export is really intellectual property, right? We contract manufacture around the world, but we're a lot more like Disney in terms of what we're exporting versus Boeing, where they're a systems integrator and exporting a finished product. But I think that's some of the things that don't get captured in the measure and in the economic expansion and those kind of things, is that we are exporting things other than what goes on a ship.
Right, and then also there's also an importance of imports in the background there too, because many of your products then become imported in the U.S. Many of the products we all buy become imported in the U.S. And so there's multiple dimensions to the international sector, and they tend to be most important on a micro level, so industry and sector specific firms. On the national level, there's that tension between imports and exports, and just the accounting of it that will I think makes it mostly a residual for the national economy, but can be very important on the local level and certainly on the firm level.
Yeah, it certainly makes a case that we want to play in the global economy.
The more you can expand markets, the better off you'll be. You'll have a more dynamic economy, and that's, I try to say some firms might not be ready to expand internationally, but they might be ready to expand domestically. And so even that, again, expands your market share, makes you a more dynamic firm. And so anything like that, I think, is healthy for the Oregon economy.
Any other questions or comments? Thank you, Dr. Dewey.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Dan, I'll call on you to introduce the budget item, please.
Thanks, Madam President. Today's discussion of the Port's proposed FY 1920 budget is the first of 4 steps in our annual budget process pursuant to state budget law. In this meeting, we will present the budget message and proposed budget, followed by a public hearing to receive comments on the proposed budget. The Port's budget, developed in conjunction with our strategic and business plans, provides the best estimate of the resources and requirements needed to achieve the Port's mission. And I think you'll hear reflected in the comments today an echo of Professor Dewey's comments that we see continued growth, but probably slowing a little bit, and that's reflected in our budget. Suzanne Kenny, our Director of Budget, Financial Planning and Analysis, is here to present the Port's proposed FY 1920 budget. Suzanne?
Good morning. Thank you.
There we go. Good morning. Thank you, Dan. And I would just echo that as well. Appreciate Professor Dewey's assessment on the economy, and I think you'll see a lot of what he referenced here reflected in our forecast as well, and our budget here that we're proposing for our fiscal year 1920 that will begin July 1. So as Dan mentioned, our strategic plan is our roadmap and our guide in developing our budget. So we'll start with a brief overview of that. We'll move into reviewing the proposed budget, both operating and capital, and then we'll end with just a recap of the budget calendar and the next couple months ahead. So just recapping our strategic plan, and you'll see this reflected in the budget as we move through the presentation. There's really 3 areas of focus. In response to the increased growth here at the airport, we need to position ourselves for the future, and a lot of capital work underway, and you'll see that as we go through presentation, as well as our focus continues on revitalizing our marine business. And we also then will be focusing on leveraging the port's strength to create a more equitable and prosperous region. All of these areas of focus are driven by our guiding principles, which include, equity, environmental leadership, financial responsibility, safety, and operational excellence. And this is all done with our organization and corporate values of leadership, inclusion, and service. So as far as overall port assumptions in the development of our fiscal 19-20 budget, Bobby Stedman and Steve McConnell were here in January and reviewed our consolidated equity plan. We will be working to incorporate that continued here in the next fiscal year into our business lines and all of our business activities. As Professor Dewey mentioned, we are forecasting modest growth across most of our business lines. We are seeing healthcare costs down a little bit for the next fiscal year, particularly our Kaiser rates, and we have also seen a shift in some of our employees moving to the Kaiser plan. So overall, our port healthcare costs are down about 3%, or we're forecasting them to be down 3%. We are forecasting our PERS rates to be up a little over $3 million, and that is a result of the rates that will go into effect July 1. Every 2 years, the rates are reset based on actuarial assessments, and that's all done by PERS. And this coming July is one of those 2-year rate changes. So that has been built into the budget that we'll be reviewing here today. We are moving forward with environmental cleanup there at Terminal 4, working on design work, and you'll see that in the budget as well. And then our focus on the Terminal 6 and the multi-use business model. Really working to market that facility as multi-use and capture other break bulk and project cargo going forward. You've heard over the last few years that we are selling off a lot of our land. You've seen some years with some large land sales, and as a result, there is less inventory. Going forward, you'll see the land sale numbers lower. And that is just a function of the supply being sold. Mentioned the focus here on PDX with our capital program. And then certainly, last but not least, working to continue to control expense growth, cost control, because we are very conscious of that. It influences the rates that we need to charge our customers, and we want to continue to provide the services at competitive rates. So we'll start with a review of the operating budget, and we'll go through some of the volume forecasts here before we start reviewing the numbers. We'll start with aviation. And again, consistent with what you heard from Professor Dewey, we are forecasting a little bit slower growth on the passenger side here at PDX, forecasting about a 1% growth. And our forecasts are driven by what we know today, given the airline's plans, the flights that they're planning to fly, and the aircraft that they're using. Not a lot of additional passenger routes. So where we're really going to see the increase is coming from load factors. So you see a little bit of an increase there in the load factors. That just means that, the few seats that have been vacant on the few flights will likely be filled. Where we are seeing some growth is on the cargo side, particularly in response to the e-commerce growth. So you see there, we're forecasting a 5% increase in cargo, and that really is where our increase in landed weight is coming from. We're seeing more flights on the cargo side in response to that e-commerce growth. For the marine business, there you see we're forecasting autos to be down about 7%. And that really is more a function of exports in response to some of the issues in the global economy, and particularly China. As far as the imports go, Toyota, Honda, Hyundai imports forecasting to be relatively flat. Forecast for domestic sales is slowing. So those imports we're looking at for next fiscal year are flat. The decline is really on the export side, seeing a decline of the Fords going out through the AWC facility there. The break bulk, that would be that project type cargo out at Terminal 6 that we're really focused on. It could be, some type of Vestas type cargo. Not sure exactly what that is going to be. There isn't a particular cargo lined up, but we are very confident that we will see cargo starting to move through there, similar to the Vestas type project cargo. On the bulk side, that would be our mineral bulks, our soda ash, our potash, and our grains. Forecasting a little bit of an increase there. We're still seeing a relative healthy demand for both potash and soda ash. Grain, we are forecasting to be down a little bit, in particular in response to some of the global impacts and more competition on the river. So grain down a little bit, but soda and potash up. And then as far as our rail container service, forecasting that to be up about 6% for next year as well. That operation has been going very well, and we expect a little bit of growth next year. So now we'll take a look at what does that mean in terms of our operating revenues and expenses. This is a little busy chart here, but I'll just kind of direct you through it. On the top section here, we have our general fund revenues. We've got our adopted budget for the current year, our proposed budget for next year, and then the variance. So for marine, you can see we're forecasting to be up a little under $2 million as a result of the volumes we just discussed. Industrial development up about $500,000, and that would be really our recurring leases. Most of that's driven by the lease increases that are provided for, typically tied to CPI. Here's the land sales that I mentioned earlier. The forecast for the current year was a little over $20 million. Next year, we're only forecasting one parcel, so 1.7. There you've got a total marine and industrial development revenue line, but what I'd really like you to focus on is the blue shaded one, because that excludes the land sales, so it really kind of normalizes our operation activities, and you can see that we are forecasting about $2.4 million increase in revenues, about 6%. The other areas of our general fund include navigation. That activity is really driven by the Army Corps of Engineers and what level of dredging needs to be done on the river. So we are forecasting a little bit of increase there. And again, that's all cost recovery. So you'll see a reflection on the expense side with those expenses going up for the dredging activities. For general aviation, down a little bit for next year. That's really a result of a couple things. The master plan has been completed. We had some master plan grant revenue in the current year. And then we will also have the runway out there closed for a couple of months for rehab. So a little bit of decline on the revenue there. Then we shift down to the aviation area of the organization. For the airline revenues, you can see we're forecasting to be up a little over $14 million. A lot of that is driven by the increase in operating expenses as well as the debt service. So as we've been completing some of these capital projects, funding them with the debt, Curtis mentioned we were in the bond market last week. As those projects come online, the debt goes into the airline rate base. So we do have some higher debt as part of their rate in the next fiscal year. The non-airline revenues, terminal concessions here, forecasting about a $2.5 million growth, 13%, much higher than our passenger growth. This will fiscal year 20 will be a full year of the concession program up and running. The last several years, we've been in redevelopment mode. We've had some locations that have been down while others have been opening. And so full year of operations in fiscal year 20, as well as some shift in gates. Some of the Horizon passengers will be walking further down on Concourse C, passing a lot of those concessions. We think that there'll be a lot of concession sales occurring in this next fiscal year. Rental cars, forecasting some growth there as well. And parking, a little bit slower growth there just because of facilities. We're really maxing out on the facilities, which is why you see this next capital project here underway to build more parking. We are seeing a little bit of an increase in our transaction costs, but again, it's really limited by the size of the facility. Our ground transportation and our transportation network providers, the Ubers and Lyfts, we're still seeing growth there. And with our forecast on the rental car, you can see that doesn't seem to be much impact to the rental car activity. This really is a rental car region. When folks arrive here, they want to rent a car and drive to the mountain, drive to wine country or the coast. But the TNCs still continue to exceed our expectation. We're forecasting just under $3 million increase in that line of revenues. So total aviation, we're looking at about a 10% increase in revenues. Total port, again, kind of focus on the bottom line here because the decline in the land sales does distort it a little bit, about 9%. And obviously you can see that a lot of that is weighted on the aviation side. But starting to kind of right that ship on the general fund side and the marine side and forecasting some revenue growth there as well. So then taking a look at the operating expenses, there you see for aviation, again, in response to the growth here at the airport, we do have a few FTEs that we are building into the budget, again, to help support the aviation activities. We'll go through that in a couple of slides, but that is reflected here in the operating expense. And again, these operating expense numbers do include the increase in the PERS rate effective July 1. There you can see the forecast for general aviation, marine, industrial development, again, isolating the land sale and the cost associated with that, and the navigation we discussed earlier. And then our Lower Willamette, our environmental program. And again, most of that is focusing on moving that Terminal 4 forward and working on the design for that. So total port, excluding the land sale impact, we're looking at about an 8% increase. And our support services, those are allocated through to our operating divisions. And those are primarily people, and you can see that just the salary increases that have been built into the budget along with the PERS impact, those groups are looking at about an 8% increase for next fiscal year. So then real quickly here, the FTEs, I mentioned PDX, we are adding a little over 7 positions, again, to help with the operating and the capital demands at the airport. But across the rest of the organization, with the exception of navigation, we are seeing decreases. In some cases, we have shifted resources to other departments to more efficiently and effectively utilize them. And there have been some divisions where we've had some vacant positions, and we've taken that opportunity to look at, can we restructure, can we utilize the resources that we have a little bit more effectively? And in some cases, yes, and you see that we have taken some of those positions then out of the budget. The navigation piece, again, that's driven by the direction from the Army Corps of Engineers, and just to support that level of dredging, we're going to need to have additional folks out there. Excluding the navigation, you can see that we are pretty much flat here. So the increase in PDX has been offset through other areas of the organization. And then you've heard quite a bit about the passenger growth over the years. And this chart just shows the FTEs were flat for a number of years, and then passengers really starting to pick up. And it's really hard to meet that demand and those needs with flat staffing levels. So the last couple of years, we have had to add positions to meet those needs. And then just a couple more slides here. This is the general fund in total, just really putting the revenues, the operating revenues and the operating expenses together. Again, the blue shaded lines here, that's isolating our kind of normal business operations. So you see the revenues that we talked about a couple slides ago, along with our expenses. So for our marine and industrial development divisions within the general fund, kind of the core areas of those operations, since our general aviation airports, our Hillsborough, our Troutdale, if there's any shortfall there, that is covered by the Port Cost Center on the aviation side. So really, our marine industrial developments divisions are kind of the core of the general fund. You're seeing the operating income before depreciation forecast to be up about 1.3 million. We do have a project built into the budget for next year to address some mitigation work on the grain elevator out at Terminal 4. That is part of what is behind the kind of full meal deal, if you will, number here, which is a negative OIBD. The 3 million positive excludes our environmental activities and that grain elevator work. Really, again, isolating the core areas of our general fund operations. And our environmental work and the grain elevator, we are forecasting that as part of our general fund sustainability long-term forecast to be funded out of savings. So we're then really focusing on how our core operations are performing and encouraged with the forecast for next fiscal year. For PDX then, to kind of summarize the operations there, a few indicators we look at: our cost per enplaned passenger. The current year, our budget was not quite $930. Our actual performance is coming in lower than that. We've had a little bit lower operating expenses and higher offsetting revenue, so I think we're going to be in the neighborhood of about $9.10. For next fiscal year, we're looking at about $10.41. Most of that is driven by that additional debt that is in their rate base, which you can see right down here. For the airlines, they're looking at additional almost $10 million in their rate base. Again, that is bonds that have been issued to fund the capital programs that are in the terminal and the airfield. And so once those projects are completed and online, that debt becomes part of their rate base. You see the Port Cost Center also has additional debt coming online, and that would be for the parking garage. So while that isn't completed yet, we have issued those bonds, and the Port Cost Center will start paying the debt next year. For the landing fee then, we're forecasting about $3.16 next fiscal year, about a 2% increase. And overall Port Cost Center income down a little bit. While we are seeing those higher revenues, a little bit higher expenses, this debt, $3.8 million of additional debt, it does bring that overall income down a little bit. And then for the Airline Cost Center, there you can see the total operating expenses that we're forecasting for their area of the operation, as well as the Port Cost Center. And then our activity, which we talked about earlier, the employments and our landed weight. So then just a couple slides here on our capital forecast for for the general fund. We have a couple of large capital projects at our GA airports. I mentioned the runway reconstruction out there at Hillsborough. Starting to do some planning for runway rehab out at Troutdale. Got a couple of dredge projects in the forecast, as well as some security upgrades there at Terminal 6 and Terminal 4. We also just want to show you the forecast, give you a feel for what we are modeling and planning for as far as additional capital for general fund. A lot of these projects will be driven by business need and timing, but we do try to keep that on the radar for planning purposes. So that's what you see going forward here. And you see a lot of the shaded bars here are planned. So again, those are projects that are in there for planning purposes. When we go to the next slide here, which is PDX, a lot of these projects are already open and underway, which will be continuing over the next several years. So not a lot of projects that are in the planning work do we have capacity to even start taking on. So the projects that you see here, I don't think are any surprise. We've talked about these already. It's going to be a busy next several years. So then the last slide is just a recap of the process here, the public process that we'll go through. We've got the public hearing today. Next month we'll be back asking for your approval to submit the budget to the Tax Supervising Conservation Commission for their review. The TSCC will hold their public hearing on June 12th following our commission meeting. And then sometime the week of June 24th, we'll have the special commission meeting to adopt the budget. And I just wanted to note on the slide here that the May 8th meeting will be in Clackamas County. Since this is a public hearing, if there's any folks that are interested in attending that meeting, wanted to point that out, that meeting will be held in Clackamas. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Suzanne. Questions?
Just one, and maybe it's just a comment, and I know that as we've gone through this, the successful sale of land assets that we wanted to get rid of is something that we've achieved over the last year. However, I think as we talk about it, we keep saying we only have 1.7, or it looks like it's really what we have succeeded at getting rid of assets that we desired to get rid of. Our available inventory is relatively depleted, but that's by intent. It's not a negative per se. I think it's good that we reflect the operating income and minus land sales. But I think really, if you look at it, it's there's some financial performance here that I think somehow gets masked in those in the land inventory being at a much lesser level, and so it's an anomaly that that is reflective in there. But I just think it doesn't. It tends to it comes across as like our financial performance is diminishing because our land inventory is diminishing, and really it's the operating budget has improved, and it just doesn't reflect the performance of the operations or the management of it minus it. And so I think maybe it's just a matter of semantics about how we talk about it, but it could be misconstrued as negative and, oh my God, we had this big bump from last year to this year, but it's really because we got rid of assets we wanted to get rid of. We had a one-time positive bump into the operating income, and but it is not reflective of operating performance. It's an anomaly as an asset sale. So anyway, I'm just maybe making myself feel better by saying it, but I know the reality of this. But it comes across, I think, in these discussions as something that is maybe a negative when in fact it's a positive.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a great point, Commissioner. And maybe Keith, I'll just call on you in just a second to talk about sort of how we're looking at this going forward. But one of the adjustments we've made is to try to make it clearer about what is cash from sales and what impact that has on our operating, so that we're really looking at operating and how are we doing financially on the operations basis. And you're absolutely right. In fact, we're doing better. We have improved, especially on the general fund side, but trying to look ahead at what is a diminishing supply. We knew it was diminishing. It was strategically headed that way. But we're also thinking differently about what we do with the remainder, with the idea that we'll also seek to generate cash, especially on the general fund side. So maybe Keith, just touch on the strategy that your team's been working on. So commissioners, I think some of them, especially the mid task force, have been brought up to speed on that, but maybe just a very broad overview on the look forward has a number of sort of drivers that will show up in the budget.
Yeah, I think we're all saying the same thing. We need to rely not on land sales to cover operating costs and rely on operating revenues to cover operating costs. And we haven't always done that. And we are moving in a direction. We're not quite where we need to be yet, but I would say future budgets will more clearly delineate that we have to live within the operating revenue picture that we have both for marine and for industrial. Land sales need to go into the bank account and be ready for future investments. And that's really where the teams are focused. And we didn't have quite those bright lines in, historically. And so this is a really interesting and new direction that we're going. And I think that we're not quite there this budget, I would say, but next budget we should be completely within that sustainable picture of operating revenues covering all of our operating costs.
Thank you. That's important to point out, I think. Go ahead.
Yes, I would like to add that I believe that based on the sales of those properties, that there's been a benefit to the community in all those cases.
I think that's probably the other thing to highlight is it was by design. We entered 10 years ago, we deployed about $100 million of capital into East Multnomah County to build economic activity. And we needed to get that capital back into our bank account because it was such a large outlay. And the goal was always to develop business parks with thriving jobs, and we feel very good about that.
I had an additional question, somewhat similar to the one I asked Professor Dewey. So when you look at your, and I know it's a short-term forecast for the next 1 to 2 years, what are the indicators that you're most concerned about, and what are the indicators that you feel fairly positive about?
Well, while you're seeing kind of the 1 year look here today, we do have a long-term forecast that we continue to update and manage. And I would say with respect to the general fund, probably the biggest thing that we're focused on is making sure that we are improving our operations so that our working capital balances are continued to be funded so that we can meet the obligations going forward. In particular, being able to fund our Lower Willamette obligations, and then obviously reinvest in our facilities and our capital program and capital needs. On the aviation side, a lot of that is driven by the economy and the increase in the passengers and being able to meet the needs of our airline partners and passengers. We do have our long-term agreement with the airlines that helps with a lot of the financials. And I would say just over the next several years, it's going to be managing that capital program, making sure that we're delivering those projects on time and on budget to meet those needs going forward.
I'm not sure if I have a question or just a comment, and this goes also to Commissioner Young's statement about how land has been developed and used, which I think is to the benefit of the community. As a commission, probably the biggest impact we have on the organization is adoption of the budget. And I think it's important for us to understand how the equity policy that we adopted is reflected in the budget. In particular, I think I see that in the money that we're spending on T4 and the cleanup there represents both an equity and an environmental goal that we have. I think the way that we've developed and are thinking about industrial land does that as well. But to the extent that staff can highlight for us how the equity lens is shown in the budget, I think that'd be really important.
Right. So there's about 18 individual plans, and we do have money dedicated in the budget for continuing education of employees and programs to move the organization forward in those areas. I think a lot of it is a mind shift, just getting that information out, getting it in front of employees so that they're constantly thinking about that in their day-to-day activities and how they can incorporate, equity. Years ago, I think it was more on the environmental side. I think environmental now is second nature. And I think, that will be the case here in a few years as well. As we move forward and look at additional investments, particularly on the industrial development side, we are also focused on, how can we meet some of those needs in the community as far as, jobs, job creation, and inclusion and equity. I think you're going to start seeing that going forward here.
Great, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Thank you. We don't have action at this time on the budget. I'm going to open the public hearing with respect to the budget if anyone has comments on the port's proposed budget. Okay, hearing none, I'll close the public hearing at this time. As I said, no action is necessary. The proposed budget will be back for commission action at the May 8th meeting. Thanks, Suzanne.
Thank you.
Does any commissioner need a presentation on the consent item, which is City of Portland Enterprise Zone 10-year reauthorization? Okay, so I'll call for a motion and second for approval of the consent item.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. Vince, I'm sorry, Vince isn't here. Darren, thank you. To introduce the next agenda item, which is a personal services contract amendment.
And as you're getting started, I'd just like to remind everybody that I'll recuse myself from participating in the discussion or the vote due to the fact that my sister-in-law is a ZGF employee. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. Thank you. This agenda item is in support of the Terminal Core Redevelopment Program, which, as you are all aware, is the overall modernization of the Portland International Airport Terminal Building. And as this program and project gains momentum and construction commences, we will present a number of agenda items over the next year, including detailed design development, enabling construction work, pre-purchases of materials, and testing and commissioning services. Last month, the Commission approved an amendment to the Hoffman-Skanska contract for Concourse B enabling work and ZGF for Concourse B construction administration. So today, George Seaman, Engineering Project Manager, is here to request two additional amendments to the project. The first is a personal services contract amendment with ZGF to provide for the design development of the first phase of the main T-Core project. The second is a personal services amendment to provide for project commissioning services for the Concourse B portion of the construction project. George.
Thank you, Darren. So as Darren mentioned, two action items today, the amendment of ZGF for about $55.3 million for the main T-Core design activities, and then a personal services contract amendment with Burns and McConnell for about $1.7 million to provide design commissioning services also for the main T-Core project. So some of the overarching goals we've talked about on the T-Core, on the whole T-Core project, we've now completed schematic design. If you remember, the existing building is a conglomeration of a number of buildings from 1956, with the original terminal building to the 70s and 2000, were built to different seismic standards than are currently required with the building. So we will be improving the seismic resiliency by extending the building out 180 feet to the west. The security checkpoints, if you've been in the mornings in the summer, are very crowded, are constrained both architecturally and structurally, and passengers can work their way all the way back into the Oregon market. So we'll be increasing the capacity with the security checkpoints by building the western expansion, putting new automated security lanes in, and then preparing for future flexibility by that there'll be an area without the constraints they currently have. Energy utilization intensity, EUI, is a measure of the amount of energy that a building uses per square foot. Our current terminal building is about an EUI of 220, At the completion of T-Core, the terminal complex will be at about 90 to 100, so we'll be significantly improving our environmental efficiency. At this point, the airlines have approved phase 1 of the project, which is the construction of the western expansion, as well as Concourse B renovation. We're currently engaging the airlines for the phase 2 approval, which will be the renovation of the ticket lobby. We anticipate presenting the airlines for approval sometime later this spring. So we've already talked about a couple of the scope elements. We'll also relocate the post-security concession nodes to the western expansion at the intersection of concourses C and D with the western expansion. We'll be constructing a new roof over the existing terminal, which will eventually eliminate the most seismically vulnerable portion of the 1956 building, which is the mezzanine and the roof over those buildings. We'll be demolishing Concourse A and then extending Concourse B, which is part of what Commission approved last month. So overall schedule, we anticipate being back to Commission a number of times over the next year for projects, for project approvals. This portion is to predominantly reflect the ZGF design, which will get us through till the end of 2021 designing the rest of the project. We anticipate being back to Commission a number of times for construction guaranteed maximum price projects. Probably June timeframe will be for about $80 million for the main Concourse B renovation. October timeframe for pre-purchase of any wood materials as well as seismic isolators, which are real long lead items for the project, will be about $20 million. On November timeframe this year should be the enabling work to prepare for the column installation, which will include prepping work both in the main terminal building as well as around the concourse corridor connector. That should be around a $30 million contract. And then next year, we'll be back for the initial activities for the utilities, which will free the place or free the space for the western expansion by moving utilities that are in that footprint out to the alleyway. That should be about a $50 million contract. Probably May time frame will be the main structural erection portion of the project, which will be $100 to $150 million in May. And then by the end of 2020, the main GMP for the project. At this point, we've started construction on the Concourse B enabling work. That project should be ongoing. We're still planning on relocating Horizon operations November timeframe to the end of Concourse A, which will enable us to construct the main portion of Concourse B starting in November 2019, which will take about 16 months to early 2021. The main T-Core project itself, enabling work should begin early next year, and then at the completion of the terminal balancing project in June of 2020, we'll start utility work. T-Core phase 1 should be complete end of 2023, and then with phase 2 approval, that'll go till the end of 2024. 2 contract amendments today. ZGF's first one to date, Commission has approved, and we've completed concept selection phase, conceptual design, and schematic design for the main T-Core project. For Concourse B itself, we have completed all the conceptual design as well as the construction document development. This amendment will include the main construction document development for the T-Core project for phase 1. We anticipate with airline approval of phase 2 being back later in the summer for the phase 2 portion of the work as well as construction administration. Commissioning services with Burns and McConnell were originally awarded under Executive Director's delegated authority for the Concourse B design support. Today we're back for the T-Core design support for the commissioning activities. And again, we anticipate being back in the future for construction for Concourse B as well as construction for the T-Core. Overall project budget was based, what you see in front of you was based on an outdated model based in February of 2017. The team is in the process of updating these cost estimates, and we'll be back to Commission later in the summer when we get these finalized with the airlines, or later in the spring, get these finalized with the airlines. These new updated budgets will reflect the schematic design completion as well as the economic conditions in the Portland region. The funding source of the project is through the Airline Cost Center. We've got a TBD up there for construction, small business participation. That should be established at about 20%. We're finalizing the numbers right now. The ZGF contract has got about 10% small business participation. They're running a little bit low right now, but we anticipate with this contract they'll be able to get that up to where they need to be. And the Burns and McConnell number is about 20% on small business participation. Staff recommends approval of the executive director's recommendations. Questions?
Thank you. Questions? Please.
Just one quick question. To what level are we seismically retrofitting? I mean, in preparation for what level earthquake or what standard are we building to?
So we're designing towards a basically today's design standards are an 8 to an 8.5, but we're doing a performance-based design to look at what happens to the roofing structure in the event a 9 to 9.5 hits. Now, it won't be a immediate occupancy building. It'll be repairable as time goes on pretty quickly. It's very, very difficult to figure out exactly what the ground's gonna shake like.
Any other questions, comments? Okay, hearing none, I'll call for motion and second to approve the executive director's recommendation. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. We'll adjourn the meeting. Thanks. Oh, I know. This is last month. Yes.
I'm getting so numb to these numbers.
That's a good question.